We're both doing it, so we know it works.
Appreciates.
Whether or not you're doing direct sales with your podcast, meaning the guest is the target, or you're doing top of funnel, meaning future listeners are being nurtured into a sale. It works both ways, and it's pretty fantastic strategy.
Hello and welcome back to Off to the Valley, a podcast that brings to life the journeys of extraordinary entrepreneurs who have ventured beyond the familiar path to create something remarkable. I'm your host, Pratik Panda, and today we are thrilled to be joined by Tim Grassin, a serial entrepreneur with 3 successful exits under his belt. Tim's latest venture, Next Big Wave, is a growth program designed to help B2B startup founders in Southeast Asia scale their companies. He has a fascinating background, having grown up in places as diverse as Kenya and Finland, before making his mark across Southeast Asia with ventures like TendoPay and Candy Banners. Over the last 15 years, he's honed his skills as a growth strategist and built a wealth of playbooks to help B2B startups scale. Beyond his ventures, he's also an avid traveler, extreme sports enthusiast, and an angel investor. Tim, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
Thanks, Pratik. Lovely introduction, by the way. Well researched and very flattering. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And you've been doing some amazing work and you've had tremendous amount of experience on the B2B growth side. But before we get into that, tell me a little bit about yourself. You grew up in a household where both your parents were diplomats. How was that growing up?
No, just my dad. Sorry. My mom was
Okay.
raising us kids. She
Hmm.
had the odd job. She was working for charities like Orphans Without Borders and things like that, but mostly raising the kids. And my dad was a diplomat. He started being a diplomat later in time. So he was initially working for the French Ministry of Education, so a teacher, and then opportunities to work abroad through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, so becoming a diplomat. And yeah, that kicked off my journey as a world traveler. Like you mentioned, we traveled in countries, at least at the time, foreign as Finland, Kenya, the UK, Denmark, and a few others. But overall, I picked that habit up and decided not to stop when I eventually left the family home. Decided to continue on and move to Canada for myself, and then later Southeast Asia, like you mentioned.
That's amazing. Tell me how Southeast Asia happened. Was it because of a work opportunity or were you exploring and decided you liked living there?
So it was purely for work. In my second company that you mentioned earlier, Candy Banners, I was looking for developers as well as creatives that were more affordable than what I could find in Toronto.
Mhm.
And I reached out to several countries that are on the list of nearshore and offshore workers. And the Philippines just happened to be one of those. And through various trials and tests, I realized that the population in the Philippines was very hardworking, spoke English. They had all the skills that I was looking for, and the prices back then were relatively affordable still. I think things are changing rapidly, but relatively affordable. And that prompted my first trip to the Philippines. And from then on, I grew the team to close to 40. And basically, the majority of the team for Candy Banners was in Manila. So I was going back and forth probably 2, 3 times a year. And yeah, that's how I started getting exposed to Southeast Asia overall.
You did mention about finding resources in the most cost efficient way to be one of the reasons that got you motivated. You did also mention that things might be changing. What do you think is the current scenario with startups in Southeast Asia? What do you observe that has changed now versus a few years ago when you first moved there?
So I was mostly referring to the cost of labor that was evolving. I think the Philippines got on the map not that long ago in terms of people leveraging their skill sets for more than call centers.
Mhm.
And a lot of people started talking about the quality of the work and all of those things. So there was an influx of, or at least a wave of hiring that happened. And while I was in the Philippines for the last 6 years, I noticed that prices started to skyrocket. I think that has calmed down a lot because people started looking elsewhere as the prices started to grow. And also the ascent of AI has taken or tackled that as well, because a lot of the creative roles that were coming out of the Philippines are slowly being replaced by AI. And unfortunately, that has sort of put pressure on prices there. So overall, I think it's going up and down based on needs. It's pretty basic supply and demand game. But you're asking about the startups in the Philippines. So that is a different topic, but I was one of the first sort of batches of startups when I moved to the Philippines for my last company, TendoPay. We were one of the first startups. When I say that, there were probably 20 startups altogether when we moved there. It was really small and absolutely zero capital. The VC scene in the Philippines was close to none. Angels were few and far apart. That's changing quite a bit. I'm seeing a lot of startups in the Philippines lately, a lot more capital flowing into the country. I think for founders who are expat founders, they've realized that it's a country that operates in English. So it makes it a lot easier if you want to do something in Southeast Asia. You really only have a few choices. I mean, you have Hong Kong and Singapore, of course. Malaysia is an option, but Philippines is pretty much the easiest one in terms of language. That's helped. And then there have been a few successful exits in the country as well as a few unicorns. So smart money has started to look at the Philippines a lot more, invest, becoming a lot more interested in the country overall. So that has also led to a wave of local founders that have awakened to the idea that, oh, the Philippines is a country where I can start a company, which was not really a reality before that. So a lot of inspiration for local founders. And yeah, I would say 1 in 10 founders I speak to right now is in the Philippines. And I speak to everyone across Southeast Asia. So it's like more represented than they used to be. Let's put it that way.
That's pretty cool. I spent a fair amount of time in Singapore, and I spent 3 years there. My last startup was headquartered in Singapore. It's still headquartered in Singapore. And we spend a lot of time moving around in that region and working with a lot of venture capitalists who focus on the Southeast Asia region. So I've seen it evolve quite a bit. And I'm talking about 2014, 15, when we first started exploring Singapore and Southeast Asia as a market. You've been helping a lot of B2B founders in the region with your new startup, Next Big Wave. Tell me a little bit about that. How did it come across, and what do you really help founders do?
Yeah. So I wouldn't call that one a startup per se. I really created Next Big Wave out of boredom after selling TendoPay. I knew that I wanted to stay in Southeast Asia, but I decided to move out of the Philippines because it was about time. In my life, every 4 years, I consider where to move next. And I decided to come to Bangkok. I really like Thailand. I had spent a lot of time here. And the idea was for me to find something to do while I was figuring out my next product, let's say. So I started writing a lot of content on LinkedIn. I decided to start a podcast, kind of similar to yours, founder for founder type of thing, to engage with the founder community in Southeast Asia, which I feel was quite underrepresented in podcasts. And through that, I started talking to lots of different founders and started poking around and understanding what their needs were. And I realized that my background in growth was a very in-need background for most startups. A lot of smart CEOs, a lot of smart ideas, but growing is something that they didn't really learn properly. And there was not a lot of talent in that space. So I started consulting with a few startups just to see what was up with them. And I realized the demand was a lot higher than I could handle as a single coach. And I got introduced with the notion of building programs through platforms like School, where you can sort of dump all your brain or your knowledge into a video course and enable like one-to-many coaching. So they would, absorb your playbooks and your different strategies, and then you would implement them in group calls or occasional one-on-one calls. And so that's what I did. And again, this was really just out of boredom or sort of personal curiosity. So I built that in probably the last 6 months and started onboarding companies just over a month ago. And so that's what my day-to-day looks like right now, is just coaching B2B startups and teaching them a few playbooks that have worked for me in the past or that I'm developing right now as I'm seeing things evolve in the region. And that's not to say that, I'm not interested in that. I really love what I'm doing, and teaching is kind of new to me, but exciting. But I'm probably still going to eventually build an actual product, an actual startup. It's just a matter of when. So this is really a big transition for me, which I love doing and I might keep doing on the side, but I don't know if this is my next startup per se.
Got it. And there's a couple of things I want to double click on there. But first things first, for all the B2B founders that are listening to this, can you share a couple of growth strategies that you've seen work pretty consistently that they can go ahead and try?
Yeah. So the first one that I teach everyone in my program is founder-led sales. Essentially, what I noticed is that there are a lot of great founders that are getting a ton of traction, whether it's from their customers or from investors, simply by putting themselves out there and being the face and the voice of their company. And it sounds obvious when you say it like that, but a majority of people that start companies shy away from that idea and want to be the introvert, hidden CEO, whereas they should be the front runner of their own companies and their businesses. And I give examples like Elon Musk to illustrate this. And obviously, Elon Musk has impacted the sales, the stock prices, and all of that for his companies while being an actual like introvert. And he's being trained to be a public speaker, but his personality doesn't scream that he loves being in the limelight, right? So every founder, in my opinion, should put themselves out there, and there's no better salesperson than them for their company. And it's just such a low hanging fruit. People love being part of your adventures and your stories and getting to know you on a deeper level. And at the end of the day, people buy from people is what I like to say, is that you'll be able to sell a lot more if it's coming from you rather than your company trying to promote itself, just being an entity that has no soul. And so I teach people to create founder-led sales strategies. That's one of the main things that I've been doing, and it works quite well. And then I have other content-related playbooks. So one of the playbooks that I used at TendoPay that was probably the single most powerful tactic that we used was creating an industry podcast, not too far from this one. And the idea was we were hitting a wall with our ICP and we couldn't really get any response rates. We had ran through thousands of emails and we knew who they were. We knew exactly where they were, but we just couldn't get them to respond or be interested in us. And then we had this idea to create a podcast that would be of interest to them, something that they wouldn't mind talking about for 30 minutes, 45 minutes, something that they felt they would bring value about, and something that would flatter their ego to be on. And we created this very low-key branded podcast about something HR professionals are interested in, because we were targeting HR professionals. And we started reaching out to the same group of people we had reached out in the past, asking them to appear on a podcast that would be something of interest to them. And the response rate shot up from less than 2% to close to 30% on some of our campaigns, with a positive response rate of 70 to 80% sometimes, depending on the campaigns, of course, but essentially like life-changing type of numbers compared to what we had before. And the idea was I was doing the podcast at a time and I could handle maybe one or two a day, but then I started training my SDRs to run these podcasts because it wasn't that scary. Like they were running through 5 to 7 questions, making the guest feel good. And then the idea was to groom that guest into being sold on a demo call. And so the way we did that is we would make sure that, first of all, they liked us. We built an authentic relationship with them through the podcast. And we had questions that would highlight some of the pain points they might have. And at the end of the conversation, we'd be able to say, hey, I realized you had this pain point, and I don't know if you know, but we also work on this other company because the podcast was separate from the brand. And this is a pain point that we're used to solving for our clients. And maybe we could jump on a quick demo call about our product to see how we could solve it for you. And more often than not, we would get a positive response on going on a demo call. But if not, we had them in a nurturing sequence and they're already warm because we had spoken to them for 30 to 40 minutes. So yeah, that filled up our pipeline quite significantly. And that's a playbook that a few of the people in my groups are using as well. And then a lot of other stuff around signal-based sales. So always using data or content to create more warm outbound strategies. That's the idea.
That's amazing. It's interesting that you shared the example of the podcast, Tim, That was my experience in my last startup that I was heading. Um, we used podcasts as a way to exactly do what you said. And it was mind blowing for me. It came as an afterthought. The idea for the podcast was more around building thought leadership and awareness. And there was a period when we were not able to move enough deals through the pipeline. And we started figuring out, hey, we're knocking enough doors. It's just sitting there and something's not moving, or we're not able to get in the attention of some of the high value customers that we want their attention on, right? So podcast became a great way for us to achieve very similar results as what you mentioned. But I was smiling when you were sharing this because A, it reminded me of my experience a few years ago. But B, I've been trying to actively tell this to founders, but there's been a significant amount of resistance to doing something like this, largely because people think, yes, podcast is a lot of effort, which it is. Having run this podcast now for a while, I know it's a lot of effort, but like you said, there is a method to the madness and a great way in which you can get high ROI, and it's absolutely worth it.
Yep, I agree. We're both doing it, so we know it works.
Appreciates.
Whether or not you're doing direct sales with your podcast, meaning the guest is the target, or you're doing top of funnel, meaning future listeners are being nurtured into a sale. It works both ways, and it's pretty fantastic strategy.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about your experience running services business as well. You had an acquisition with your service business also?
Both my service businesses got acquired before TendoPay. So Stinson Design and Candy Banners. And those are entirely different businesses, right? So what was interesting for me there was finding a high value service that I could productize and essentially systemize every single process around, scale it as much as I could within the time frame where I was going to run out of or what I was going to become bored, which for a service business is, let's say, 4 to 5 years. You start getting bored of the repetition. So I would scale them, systemize them, and then sell them. Majority of the sales happen out of pure luck, but regardless, it was really a game of just like automating the business as much as possible. And by the fourth year, usually I was able to automate most of it, have people in place to run it, and it would have become a cash cow if not acquired. So I knew in the back of my mind that it was a business I was building just to leave in place and let it run. I wasn't going to scale it forever. Sorry, what did you want to know about those? I just went on a rant there.
So, yeah, I think one thing to know is you mentioned that you knew when you started it off that at some point you would either want to just let it run on its own
Yep.
or potentially find an exit and then go do another thing. Did you do anything in particular consciously to prepare your startup for an exit?
Yeah. There's a great book that I read relatively early on. It's called Built to Sell by John Warlow. Does it ring a bell? It's a great book. And after reading that book, I figured out that every process can be automated, either fully automated or make someone the piece of the automation so that they can run it for you. And the idea was that if a business runs by itself and you don't get involved, whether it's in sales or management or anything, it's a sellable business because it becomes very easy to prove to the buyer that they're buying cash flow. They're not buying you or your brand equity, or at least your personal brand equity. And so in the back of my mind, I said, look, if I build it that way, at least I know that I can always exit it and it'll be very easy to prove. And that actually just happened to be the case. When we got approached for Candy Banners by one of our clients who wanted to internalize production of their digital assets, they said, look, we're going to have to keep you on board. We're going to have to do an earn-out, et cetera. And well, me and my partner, we said, well, you know, we don't want to do that. And we can prove to you that we don't need to do that. And it was shocking to them because it's just such a standard thing to do, an earn-out, right? People don't expect you to say no. But then we showed them that the last 6 months before they reached out to us, we had not touched the business. We did a bit of accounting, basic stuff that, bookkeeping is something we could have replaced ourselves on, but we just did it because we wanted to. But everything else, from client management to new client acquisition to all operations, we had not touched it one bit for 6 months. And when we were able to prove that by emails, by chat logs, all of that good stuff, and also employee interviews, they realized that indeed we like the earnout was just a way to punish us almost for creating something good. And instead there was like a monetary earnout. So like we had to reach our targets to unlock a tranche of the payout, but everything else was pretty basic, no work needed.
I want to ask you a little bit more about how to or when should you start approaching an exit sort of plan, because a lot of times founders get emotionally attached. And I used to be one of those in my early 20s with my first couple of startups. I was very emotionally attached and wouldn't be able to identify the best moment to explore an exit option. And one of my mentors once said that, and this might sound harsh to a lot of people, that nobody wants to marry a terminally ill patient. So that's the thing with startups. A lot of times founders would think about an exit when they're doing terribly, not able to raise
Mhm.
money. It's a sinking ship and you try to scramble to find a buyer, and it's the worst negotiation place that you can
Absolutely.
be in. Is there anything for all the listeners here, whether they're running B2B product companies or services businesses, when is a good time to start thinking about an exit? And does it make sense to keep yourself emotionally detached to the transaction?
Yeah. I think timing an exit is like timing the stock market, right? It's very hard to do. And we always hear about people who successfully did it, but it doesn't mean that they did it intentionally. I think they were just lucky. I think timing an exit, like you said, it has to be done based on momentum. When things are going really, really well, you can negotiate a better multiple. It's kind of like fundraising. You rarely fundraise when things are going badly, right? It's going to be hard to negotiate good terms if you're tanking, you have 2 months runway, and you desperately need the money. Otherwise, you're folding shop. So I think it's the same thing. And I think you have to consider two things in a liquidity event. Like, first of all, there's going to be the exit, sure. But before that, you could also look at secondaries. And a lot of founders admit the idea that secondaries are a powerful way to get some cash flow while still operating the business and de-risking yourself. And for me, selling the business just happened at a good time where were going well, and I got offered an opportunity. But I always regretted selling those two businesses because while the first business I sold, after I sold it, it went on to grow by tenfold in 5 years. And it was an insanely profitable, probably 50% EBITDA business. So kind of stung that I had to sell it. And that one was a sale that just happened out of necessity. The second one, just as a great opportunity, a client comes to knock on your door. Like, if you want cash and you want to do something else, that's a great idea. If you're building a business for the only purpose of selling, then you should always brace yourself for a sale. Like, don't say, hey, I'm only selling in 10 years because maybe the market will collapse. And you know how AI wiped out a lot of startups? They weren't ready for that. And if their only goal was to wait 10 years before they sold, they might probably got wiped out and there's nothing there to make money on. So I would say always be ready to sell and just make sure that you don't wait for an negative inflection point before you start considering a sale. When things are going up and things are going well, probably after Series A, Series B, already start considering that a sale is on the table. And just make sure your company is prepared for a sale so that everything is clean. Your data room is always up to date because sales can happen very fast, right? When you have a corporate buyer or another startup trying to acquire you, they move fairly fast, and it's better to be ready for that than for them to shop around for your competitor.
Yeah, I think that last point is extremely valuable and was my experience as well. Having clean books and a clean data room
Yeah,
is supremely valuable in helping build confidence in the sale and also helping it move faster.
correct.
So I'm going to shift this conversation to the complete start of the spectrum. So we talked about exit. Let's talk a little bit about MVPs, because you also help a lot of startups figure out
Yes.
MVPs and how to test their products. What's something that you see as a common mistake a lot of founders make when they're in their MVP stage, and something that people can do to maybe not
Yeah.
make the
So
same mistake?
MVP is a fluid concept for me because I've been told that I'm too early stage, even in my MVP. So I talk about validators more than MVPs, and I like to validate my ideas through even single feature or like fake apps or fake products to validate the interest of people in your product or services. MVPs, I think the main mistake people make is that they don't really know how to define an MVP. And even if it's in the title, minimum viable product, everyone just wants to throw more at it because they feel like the minimum viable product still requires several features. And so they don't really spend enough time thinking about the essence of what they're selling. Like, what is the one value added service or feature that you're building that might be interesting for your ICP? So I would say that's the biggest mistake. And to alleviate that mistake, that's why I prefer validators rather than MVPs, because validators, you literally have one hypothesis and you create an experiment to validate that hypothesis. And to illustrate that point, I can tell you that when we started TendoPay, we wanted to validate one hypothesis after the other. And so our idea when we started was that the Philippines had a rising e-commerce market, and it was very new because players like Lazada, Shopee wasn't even around when we started. So Lazada was really dominating, and they had created a copycat of Amazon for Southeast Asia. And that was booming because there was really no other e-commerce back in the days. This is not even that far long ago. This is like 7 years ago. So it tells you how behind Southeast Asia was, right? And to further illustrate how behind they were, the credit card rate of penetration in Southeast Asia was about 5%. And in the Philippines was probably lower than that. And that meant that to pay for their shopping on Lazada, people had to pay with cash on delivery, meaning they would have to wait for the delivery guy to show up at their door, give them an exact change, get like a proof of payment. And I mean, the process was just outrageous coming from North America where everything is paid by Apple Pay or Google Pay or credit card. And so when we realized that, we realized there was a big gap in the payment space, and buy now, pay later was sort of growing in North America, Europe, Australia. And so we decided that a buy now, pay later option would be a good idea for the Philippines. And so what we wanted to test was if someone lands on an e-commerce page and they see the option to buy a product full price or pay in installments for a slightly higher price, would they choose the installments? So we created a fake landing page for a product, or a fake product page, product display page for a pair of sneakers. And in this page, we displayed the buy now button and then the buy now, pay later button. And the idea was, okay, we want to validate if they would click on one or the other. Boom. We ran some ads. 90% or more clicked buy now, pay later. That was the first hypothesis. The second one was, okay, now we want to test how much information they'd be willing to give us in order to be approved for a buy now, pay later account. So we created a type form and we started asking all sorts of crazy questions about their employment, background checks, how much they made, what their relatives' information was like. We wanted to test how far they would take it. We ran several experiments. But essentially, that's the second validator, is people were willing to give a ton of information about themselves to get approved for that. Yeah. And you get the idea, right? We would create an experiment. We had a hypothesis, we created an experiment, and we would validate. And that's where the debate has been with several people that I've had. This is not an MVP in the sense that you don't have a full product that people would be willing to pay, but you're building up towards it. And you don't have to build that whole MVP to test out all these things. Like we could have built an MVP and then no one wanted it because we didn't validate all that information. So to lead to the MVP, you need to build all these validation or hypothesis validations, guide what your MVP will look like. Eventually we did build an MVP, which was completely manual, where we had a plugin, it was a WooCommerce plugin, and a few stores added it, and it would display exactly those two buttons on your product display page and run you through like a type form. We would collect the information, we would manually approve you, and we would send the money to the store if we approved that account. So the payment was made and the person would receive their item. That was the MVP. It was at very low code, all manual processes, but at least there was a product. Someone was getting value out of it and they were willing to pay us because we would charge interest on it. Hope that made sense.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I like the approach of validators because couple of takeaways there. One is, as you said, MVP, what is MVP for you is hard to define. And I've seen numerous founders, especially amazingly smart technical founders, who can get into this zone of continuing to build an MVP and you never get the product out.
Because they love building.
Yeah.
They hide behind building. It's comfortable.
Yep. So I think that, and then the other takeaway from this is really doing those fast experiments and creating one hypothesis at a time and just moving quickly. A lot of times we've made this mistake. I've done it too, where we're trying to test too many things at the same time, and it's hard to derive results because you don't know what exactly happened.
100%.
So you run an
100%.
experiment without knowing, okay, what do I derive out of this? So I think I love that. Thank you so much for sharing it. You've also talked a little bit about challenges with being judged about your founder journey and misrepresentation and things like that, right? Can you tell a little bit more about that? I know a lot of founders struggle through that, but rarely does anyone speak out loud about it. One of the things I'm trying to do with this podcast is a lot of things that are nice and exciting are obviously visible on the outside. More often than not, the founder journey is pretty stressful and you see a lot of lows, and it can be a lot of times a fairly big emotional blow. Have you experienced any of that? What did you do to handle it?
I mean, I think we both know that the main pressure comes from your family, right? Especially when you study something that is as stable as finance. And well, you told them and fed it to them that you were going on this corporate trajectory that was going to pay well, be very stable, be well recognized. And all of a sudden you say, hey, I'm dropping all that and I'm going to start a business that you struggle to explain to your older parents what these businesses are because they're all digital. They don't really understand it. As much as they try to make an effort and they want to be part of your life, you dumb it down and they still don't get it fully. And that's a frustration for both parties. And I think because of this disconnect, parents are proud to talk about their kids to their friends. And if they can't really explain what their kids do, it makes it difficult for them to absorb and to be comfortable with it. And so between them not understanding what you do, not being explained what you do to their friends, and then them feeling like you're taking a big risk on your life when all they want for you is stability and comfort, I think that's where the sort of the pressure comes in. And not to mention the financial pressure of not having a comfortable cushion or salary. So I lived through that, especially in my first business. After the first business, they understood that, okay, this guy knows what he's doing. Now he has a cushion to fall back on. So they stopped worrying about it, but definitely there was a lot of pressure to begin with. And then I think from the rest of my acquaintances and friends, there was not as much because they all understand the concept of startups. They all understand the concept of being self-employed. But internally, I do struggle still for having never had a salary. After my studies, like I did have a finance job for a little while, like right during my studies and right after, but that was really student salary, right? Like I'm talking about a comfortable salary equal to my 15-year professional experience. I've never had that. And sometimes I look at my friends or peers who are getting like multiple 6-figure salaries plus bonuses, plus this, plus that. I'm like, what? Like, I wish I had that sometimes, just the comfort of someone just telling me, hey, let's do this. Job well done. Here's your monthly massive salary. And, let's do it again next month. For me, it's like, I'll take whatever I need to live. And then the rest of my money I make during liquidity events.
Yeah.
And I also don't really touch that money. It's all reinvested immediately. So I never feel like a huge comfort where I'm like, hey, I'm making $50K a month and I can spend it because I'm getting it again next month. I'm just like, no, I sold my business. Everything's going into stocks or real estate because that's my cushion when I retire, because I won't have retirement basically.
Yeah.
So it's a different mindset. So internally and externally, there are pressures and you have to be ready for that. But just the excitement of doing what I want every day and building things that excite me is enough to compensate for all that.
That is invaluable, really. A friend of mine just yesterday, we were talking, he's wanting to do his first startup and he was asking me, how do you keep going? And I was like, I think every founder agrees that the journey is treacherous, to say the
Hmm.
least, but it's exciting to do what you really want to do at your own will. And if you're truly passionate about it, you have a pretty good journey. Even if you experience a lot of shitty days, overall, you would never regret doing that. On the contrary, if you don't do it, probably you would still regret it. And when you shared your experience, it reminded me of my B school days. One of the things one of my academic directors was asking me is, I used to head the entrepreneurship committee, and my job was to encourage more students to start businesses out of B school. And I think in my batch, it was maybe just me, and in my batches ahead, maybe a couple of folks. And my director was asking me, why aren't we able to encourage more students to start their own businesses? I was like, we get such fancy jobs and high pay that carrot is just too difficult to avoid. You come into a B school program, take a lot of debt that you have to pay off. And at the end of the program, you're getting what a lot of people would consider a dream job that pays really well. It'll take care of your debt, give you a great lifestyle. And it's really, really hard at that point to make a choice that, hey, I'm going to give this all up to go figure
Yeah.
out a startup journey. So the other thing that was relatable to me was from your story, this thing about convincing or getting some approval from your parents, right? And we all seek that at some point. And having come from an Asian household, it was expected to go down a particular path, and I didn't do that. And a hack that I found eventually was, well, the shift happened when my parents started to take me more seriously, is when I started to appear in news shows, television shows, newspapers. It didn't mean anything to me, to be honest, but suddenly my parents started to think, oh, he must be doing something
Mhm.
for real
Yeah.
because he's on TV. And I kept saying that to a lot of my founder friends eventually, that if you feel stressed about this, do some good PR. Doesn't matter if it helps your business or not. You would settle this thing with your parents and they would probably feel more
Mm,
confident that you're on to something more real.
love it. That's smart. Never did that, but that's the good idea.
Yeah. As we wrap things up, any last comments for people who are listening? There's B2B founders who are in this journey. Any tips and advice from you having done this for such a long time?
I think it's important to have peers, good mentors, people to bounce ideas on, what I call sounding boards. I never really had that many when I was starting out. So if you're listening and you feel like you need someone to spar with, feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to help at this point in life. The whole idea behind my podcast and even the next big wave program I have, I don't charge a lot because I want to be able to help people rather than just make money. And so just in general, if you just want a sparring partner, someone to talk to or a sounding board, just feel free to reach out to me. I'm always happy to give out free help and to have a quick discussion with anyone who's a founder. B2B is more my specialty, so I'll have more insights for you. So yeah, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm sure Pratik will share a link. And yeah, always happy to chat.
Thank you so much, Tim, for sharing all this amazing information. Lots of helpful, actionable tips and advice. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Well, thanks for having me, Pratik. Really enjoyed it.
And that wraps up today's episode. Before we sign off, I would like to thank you for your support and thanks for tuning in. If you loved today's episode, then don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and never miss an episode. Be kind, be happy, challenge the norm. I'll see you folks again for the next one.